For 6 generations the Sanson family pulled the lever in Paris, a dynasty that turned execution into a family trade and left behind journals that read like confessions. Executioners everywhere were both indispensable and despised, hereditary names in Europe, ostracized castes in Japan, notorious figures like England's Jack Ketch who became a household curse. From their own memoirs come moments of grim routine, strange rituals and superstitions kept to ward off bad luck, and the weary insistence that this was simply a public service. These accounts don't just shock, they explain why entire families held the job for centuries, how societies justified their existence, and what it cost the men who did the work. You'll hear first-hand testimony of burnout, of numbness that crept in after year upon year of killing, and of the small, private rights they used to stay human. Stay with me and you'll meet the voices behind the hood, family sagas, forbidden superstitions, and raw memoir fragments that force us to ask whether hatred and necessity can ever be separated. Inherited burden. The role of the executioner was often a hereditary, inescapable duty, like the Sanson dynasty, a cursed social caste into which one was born, creating a lineage of official killers. In France the Sanson family stands as the clearest illustration of a vocation passed down like an heirloom, one that no one wanted but everyone depended upon. Several generations of Sansons held the office of public executioner, a hereditary appointment that created a direct line of official killers serving crown and state. Surviving memoir fragments and administrative records show how the role was transferred within the family not just as work but as an assigned social identity, with sons trained in the mechanics of the trade and in the rituals and paperwork that accompanied it. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most documented of the line, recorded in his notes both the technical minutiae of his profession and a weary awareness of being trapped within a family destiny. In Britain a similar continuity is visible in the Pierrepoint family. Uncle, father, and son followed the same grim path. Albert Pierrepoint later reflected in his memoirs on the process of learning, how technique, timing, and calm were taught at the kitchen table and on the scaffold. Training was pragmatic, it was also a way to normalize what would otherwise shatter a single life. Families like the Pierrepoints made domestic arrangements around an office that marked them apart from neighbors and often shaped career choices for children from infancy onward. The office did not just employ them. It defined marriage prospects, social intercourse, and next-of-kin expectations. Across Europe and beyond, official executioners formed quasi-castes, essential yet stigmatized, protected yet isolated. Contemporary accounts, municipal logs, and the memoirs of practitioners repeatedly note the paradox. Executioners held legal appointments, drew stipends or fees, and enjoyed certain municipal privileges that came with the need for an official agent of punishment. At the same time they were regular targets of social ostracism, separate burial grounds, avoidance at markets, and laws or customs that restricted where their families could live or whom they could dine with. This dual status made the role both a fiscal anchor and a social noose. The human cost shows clearly in personal writings. Memoirs capture slow erosion, burnout that arrives not from a single act but accumulation. Executioners describe developing a professional detachment as a survival mechanism, efficiency and calm replaced shock. Yet that detachment had consequences. Some practitioners boasted of perfect procedures and humane practice, while others confessed recurring nightmares, numbness, or a creeping sense that their work was hollowing out moral life. Several memoirs, especially from those who had long careers, turn from technical detail to reflection, questioning whether the office could ever be reconciled with ordinary human feeling. Superstition and ritual threaded through hereditary practice as well. Accounts from urban chronicles and family recollections note talismans, small household rites, and neighborhood myths designed to keep misfortune at bay. In some societies executioners and their kin were lumped with other, unclean, trades into an outcast stratum. In Japan, for instance, certain hereditary groups performed the functions of executioner and were socially segregated in ways that were recorded by travelers and officials. Such beliefs reinforced heredity. If the occupation carried visible curse-like associations, it discouraged outsiders from applying and made passing the role to kin almost inevitable. Justification and resignation both appear in first-person accounts. Many executioners framed their work as dutiful service, an ugly but necessary instrument of public order. They spoke of legal authority, the need to prevent vigilante bloodshed, and the responsibility to make sentences as swift and as painless as possible. Still, later reflections, especially from those who retired or left the role, often include moral re-evaluation. Some concluded that their technical skills simply improved the process without addressing larger questions of justice, others stopped on conscience grounds. These tensions, the hereditary imposition, the ritualized professionalism, and the slow accrual of psychological strain, make clear why the office, for those born into it, was less a career than an inherited burden. Professional toolkit, the job required specific, evolving instruments, axes, guillotines, later chemical injectors, demanding technical skill and maintenance, which bureaucratized the act of killing. In France, the Sanson family epitomizes how the executioner's toolkit evolved into a family trade, and Charles-Henri Sanson's memoirs are frank about the meticulous care given to instruments. Axes were not merely blunt blades, they were balanced and weighted to the preferences of the beheader, periodically retempered and honed until the grain and swing matched a practice stroke. When the guillotine replaced the axe as the instrument of state, Sanson and his successors treated it like a machine in a workshop, sheaves and screws checked, the sliding groove oiled, the blade regularly inspected for nicks, and the profile of the lunette adjusted so the neck sat exactly where it should. Executioners' accounts emphasize that these were technical tasks, mechanical skills as exacting as any craftsman's, rather than rough tradesmen's work. British executioners from the Pierrepoint dynasty recorded similar concerns in their recollections, noting how hanging required precise calculation as much as muscle. Ropes and knots were engineered devices, knots had to be positioned to cause instantaneous unconsciousness, and the long drop was not guesswork but a measurement informed by weight and anatomy. Henry and Albert Pierrepoint, in the oral histories and autobiographical fragments attributed to them, described how a misjudged drop could mean a prolonged, botched death, and how that knowledge sharpened their attention to calibration, to record-keeping, to a ritual of measurement before each execution. Social paradox, executioners lived in a state of sanctioned ostracism. They were granted privileges, money, housing, the right to plunder the condemned, yet were also reviled and shunned, embodying a necessary but polluted figure. In France, the Sanson family stands out in contemporary accounts as a multi-generational example of how the office of executioner could be both institutionalized and socially corrosive. Charles-Henri Sanson's own memoirs describe a steady stream of official demands, payments, and the privileges attached to his office, housing close to the place of execution, a recognized salary from the crown, and the customary ability to remove the personal effects of the condemned. At the same time, his pages record an intimacy with death that no ordinary citizen faced and a social margin that widened the more publicly visible he became. He was an official servant of justice who nonetheless recorded encounters with townspeople who crossed the street to avoid him or refused ordinary courtesies. His professional openness in writing only highlighted how private the rest of his life had to be. Across the channel, the Pierrepoint family illustrates the same settled contradiction in another cultural register. Albert Pierrepoint's later memoirs present a man proud of his craft and meticulous in technique, convinced that a quick, well-executed hanging spared suffering, yet those same recollections admit to the emotional toll exacted by repeated participation in taking life. He spoke bluntly about the training of assistants, the bureaucratic routines that reduced fear on the day itself, and the ways a family name both guaranteed employment and branded descendants. Practical advantages existed: regular pay, official assignment, a narrow path to livelihood, but they arrived wrapped in a stigma that affected marriage prospects, social friendships, and the quiet rights of community belonging. Dynasties were an unavoidable feature of the trade and helped lock families into their paradoxical social niche. Fathers passed skills, addresses, and sometimes the official appointment itself to sons. Long lines of service meant expertise, but also meant visibility. This hereditary transmission offered stability, exemptions from certain civic duties, a roof often provided by local authorities, occasional pensions. It also concentrated the taboo. Records and memoirs show isolated examples of executioners finding alternative livelihoods, running a small inn, working in a slaughterhouse, selling funeral trinkets, yet such pursuits rarely dissolved the community's view of them as polluted. Neighbors might accept payment but not company. Children of executioners could inherit both a small fortune and a lifetime of whispered reputations. Superstition thickened the division. Accounts from various jurisdictions preserve rituals and talismans used by executioners themselves to ward off perceived ill luck, simple habits, practical precautions, odd behaviors that became tradition. At the same time, local populations developed their own customs around the executioner's presence, avoiding certain streets, telling stories that painted him as inhuman, or assigning him an almost mystical ability to attract misfortune. Executioner memoirs speak to the necessity of ritualizing the work, steps and checklists that made the act repeatable and soothed conscience, and to the rituals of denial that colleagues, officials, and families cultivated to live with what they had to do. Burnout and moral justification appear repeatedly in first-person accounts. Repetition led many executioners to cultivate a professional coolness and an ethical framework in which they were instruments of an impersonal system rather than autonomous killers. Some justified their role by arguing that their technical competence meant the condemned suffered less than they would had executions been bungled, others framed obedience to law as the only legitimate basis for the violence they performed. Still, these same accounts record sleepless nights, intrusive dreams, strained marriages, and a turn to alcohol or withdrawal as coping mechanisms. The rituals of the trade, precise knots, measured pauses, the clinical mindset, offered temporary shelter from moral distress but did not erase it. Those archival voices and memoirs make the paradox plain: societies could not fully do without the executioner, and so they conferred tangible entitlements, yet in assigning those entitlements they also codified exclusion. The executioner stood as a living contradiction, supplied with the means to survive by the very system that condemned him to social exile. Contemporary historians and readers of those memoirs are left with an image that is neither simple hero nor simple monster, but a figure shaped by necessity, trained into competence, and haunted by the social pollution that accompanied a role the community needed to keep at arm's length. Psychological and ethical duality, the executioner grappled with the trauma of the first time, the dissonant role of healer, providing last comforts, historically linked to medicine, and the ultimate refuge of justification. First was just following the law. Albert Pierre Point, in his candid memoirs, described the seismic shock of the first time he carried out an execution: physical nausea, hands that would not steady, and a private reckoning that did not fit the public role. German executioner Johann Reichardt left similar traces in the record. His accounts and court testimony afterward show a man repeatedly returning to the same justification, duty, while privately haunted by what he had done. These first experiences were pivotal. They established a psychological pattern, acute trauma at the outset, followed in some by an attempted professional detachment. Contemporary observers and later historians alike have noted that the initial visceral response rarely disappeared entirely, even when technique and routine dulled outward signs. This trauma did not occur in a vacuum. Many executioners belonged to long-standing families whose work and identity were passed down across generations. The Sanson dynasty in France is one oft-cited example of hereditary executioners whose records and family papers illuminate how the trade became an inherited social function as much as an occupation. Such dynastic continuity produced complicated loyalties. On the one hand, these families were necessary agents of the state's punitive system, trained in specific skills and entrusted to perform public functions. On the other hand, they lived under social sanctions that pushed them to the margins: ostracism, restrictions on residence or marriage in some societies, and a cultural stigma that marked them as liminal figures, outcasts who were nevertheless indispensable. The role of the executioner frequently encompassed caregiving tasks that sit uneasily beside the image of the state's instrument of death. Memoirs and municipal records show executioners preparing the condemned for their last moments, ensuring they were clothed or unencumbered, sometimes overseeing last words, and passing on practical comforts, simple measures intended to ease a person's final minutes. Historically, that proximity to the body and familiarity with cutting and suturing intersected with local medical practices. Executioners often had knowledge of anatomy and were called upon for tasks that required a steady hand, whether in public dissections or in treating wounds. This duality, part technician, part reluctant comforter, created a dissonant identity. Executioners were trained to end life, yet repeatedly tasked with tending to the human being standing before them. Prolonged exposure produced disappearance of the public figure. The role evolved from a public, ritualistic performer to a hidden, technocratic functionary of the modern state, leading to the profession's symbolic disappearance as public spectacle was replaced by private, clinical administration. Across Europe, entire families became synonymous with the office of death, producing generations who learned the craft at a child's knee and kept manuals, tools and techniques as closely guarded as any guild secret. The Sanson family in Paris and the Pierrepoints in Britain are the most cited examples in contemporary accounts. Their names appear again and again in memoirs and court records, not simply as employees of the crown or state but as hereditary custodians of a socially compromised trade. Memoirs written by those who occupied the post, most famously the reflections left by Albert Pierrepoint and the published recollections attributed to members of the Sanson line, describe an apprenticeship that was technical, ritualized, and isolating. The knowledge that once lived publicly in squares and marketplaces, the ropemaker's knot, the exact angle of a blade, the choreography of a crowd, was handed down within families even as the public spaces shrank. Social status for these dynasties was peculiar and contradictory. Executioners were legally necessary, often indispensable to the maintenance of order, yet they were treated as social outcasts. Contemporary memoirs recount special dispensations, tax reductions, official lodgings, the right to collect fees that others could not charge. At the same time, executioners and their kin were subject to taboos and civic exclusions, barred from certain guilds, forced to live at the margins of towns, treated as someone to be seen only when the state required them. Short sentences and long pauses alternate in their testimonies. One passage will detail the meticulous tallying of fees and the bureaucracy that surrounded an execution, the next will return to a single, bitter line about the loneliness of wearing the office like a second skin. These contradictions, necessary yet shunned, shaped family dynamics across generations, often producing marriages within narrow social circles and encouraging secrecy about the practical trade behind the family name. As penal regimes matured, eyewitness accounts show the performance aspect of execution steadily stripped away. Where once a scaffold was built in a marketplace and the populace came to witness a ritual that mixed justice, moral instruction and communal catharsis, the practice migrated behind prison walls, under lock and official witness lists. Albert Pierrepoint's memoirs, and other first-person writings from hangmen and headsmen, emphasize how this relocation changed the work itself: fewer theatrics, more checklist. Execution became a procedural operation governed by timetables, forms and oversight committees. Short sentences will underscore the change. Teams replaced singular public figures. The shift was not merely spatial but symbolic. The ceremonial visibility that made executioners recognizable to townsfolk gave way to an enforced anonymity imposed by bureaucracies attempting to render the act clinical and ostensibly impartial. The psychological consequences of that transition appear repeatedly in memoir literature. Older generations describe ritual as a coping mechanism: prayers murmured before performing the act, patterns of cleanliness and the laying out of implements with care. Such practices had the dual purpose of warding off superstition and preserving dignity for all involved. Modern functionaries, however, often write of routinization and burnout. Long paragraphs in these accounts map how repeated exposure to death, now administered in sterile rooms with medical-style protocols, led to emotional numbing or acute moral distress. Some executioners report reliance on dark humor or mechanistic detachment, others detail a slow erosion of conviction about deterrence and retribution. Albert Pierrepoint, for example, recorded a change in perspective over his career and later expressed skepticism about the moral utility of his work, which mirrors the pattern in other testimonies. Superstitions and informal justifications persisted even as the office grew more technical. Family legends and talismans traveled with dynastic lines. Certain knives, cords or boxes of company papers were treated like heirlooms. Executioners' memoirs speak of small, private rituals that continued beneath the official procedures: a coin placed with the condemned, a silent moment before the key was turned, a practiced phrase uttered to steady the hand. These acts provided meaning when public ritual vanished. At the same time, memoirs also record the rationalizations that modern administrators encouraged: legal duty replaces divine mandate, procedural fairness supplants spectacle. The language shifts, from sermon and spectacle to protocol and competency, but the human need to justify the act remains. That symbolic disappearance has institutional consequences. Modern states, according to numerous accounts, deliberately obscure the identity of those who administer capital punishment. Multiple actors perform parts of the procedure, credentials and roles are dispersed, and medical professionals often refuse participation, pushing the technical aspects onto prison staff or contracted specialists. This diffusion is captured in contemporary testimonies as a double-edged sword. Anonymity protects individuals from immediate social stigma. Yet it also erases the person who must carry the moral weight, spreading responsibility across a faceless apparatus and leaving those who do act more vulnerable to burnout and alienation. Memoirs conclude with wrenching observations about how the removal of public ritual did not remove human cost, it merely relocated it into administrative rooms, into filing cabinets and witness lists, and into the private memories of a few whose families had once been the public face of a grim and contested duty. Centuries of testimony, memoirs like Albert Pierrepoint's and the accounts kept by families such as the Sansons, reveal a life lived at the edge of society, a hereditary craft passed down through dynasties, a profession both reviled and required. Executioners were housed apart, married within their ranks, buried in separate plots, outcasts by custom, public servants by law. Their diaries speak of monotonous duty and sudden moral crises, of burnout that came not in a single storm but as a slow erosion, sleepless nights, drink as a salve, the numbing of conscience. Superstitions and rituals, charms, last rites performed with extra care, taboos around mirrors, became tools to hold a fractured self together. Justifications ranged from a firm belief in order and law to the simple necessity of feeding a family and preserving a line. We've traced how history turned a human role into a symbol, how families carried the burden, how personal grief was folded into public duty. If this story unsettled or fascinated you, you're not alone. These questions force us to examine our own ideas of justice and responsibility. Share your thoughts below, like and subscribe if you want more deep dives into the human stories behind historical institutions. Next time we'll follow the movement to abolish capital punishment and see how changing laws reshaped, and ultimately erased, the executioner's world. Stay curious.